I knew things were about to get messy when I saw Robert Hendricks unloading 40 bags of concrete mix from a rental truck at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. But I never imagined he would actually go through with something this insane. My name is Ethan Phillips, and I have lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Naperville, Illinois, for the past 6 years. It is one of those cookie-cutter communities where every house looks almost identical, with beige siding, black shutters, and manicured lawns that the HOA president, Regina Daniels, inspects with the intensity of a drill sergeant. Regina is exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen out loud. She is 52, has that distinctive "can I speak to the manager" haircut that defies all logic and gravity, drives a white Escalade, and wears velour tracksuits like it is still 2003. She runs our HOA with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive emails and threats of fines. Robert lived 3 houses down from me, a quiet guy in his early 40s who kept to himself. He worked from home doing something with computer programming. And before all of this started, the most rebellious thing I had ever seen him do was let his grass grow half an inch taller than the HOA mandated 2 inches. That was before Regina decided to make his life a living hell over his backyard landscaping. It started about 4 months ago when Robert installed a small vegetable garden in his backyard. Nothing crazy, just some tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in raised beds. He did not ask for HOA approval because, honestly, who thinks you need permission to grow tomatoes in your own backyard? Regina thought differently. She showed up at his door with a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, Section 12, Subsection 4, which apparently stated that all significant landscaping changes required written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. A committee that consisted of Regina and her 2 cronies, Barbara and Susan. Robert removed the garden beds. He followed the rules, but that was just the beginning. Regina started finding problems everywhere. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. His front door wreath was too large. His holiday lights stayed up 2 days past the January 5th deadline. Each violation came with a $50 fine that escalated to $100 if not paid within 10 days. Robert paid every single one, but I could see the frustration building every time I talked to him over the fence that separated our properties. The real turning point came when Regina discovered that Robert had a septic system rather than being connected to the municipal sewer line. About half the houses in our neighborhood were built in the early 90s before the sewer lines were extended to our area, and they still operated on septic. It was completely legal, properly maintained, and inspected regularly. But Regina saw an opportunity. She started complaining that she could smell sewage coming from Robert's property. She sent emails to the entire neighborhood claiming there was a health hazard. She called the county health department 3 times in 2 weeks, making anonymous complaints. Each time, inspectors came out, tested Robert's system, and found absolutely nothing wrong. The septic field was functioning perfectly, well maintained, and posed 0 risk to anyone. But Regina would not let it go. At the March HOA meeting, which I attended because I wanted to see how far Regina would push this, she proposed a new bylaw requiring all homes with septic systems to connect to the municipal sewer line within 6 months or face daily fines of $200. The cost to connect would be somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 per household. When Robert pointed out that this was targeting only 8 homes in a community of 75, Regina said it was about maintaining property values and community standards. The vote passed. Regina, Barbara, and Susan voted yes. The two other board members who occasionally showed signs of independent thought were conveniently absent that night. Robert stood up, looked directly at Regina, and said something I will never forget. "You want to play games with my property? Fine. Let me show you what happens when I follow every single rule to the letter." I did not understand what he meant until that Tuesday morning when the concrete showed up. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when Robert waved me over. He looked different that day, like something fundamental had shifted in him. There was this determined gleam in his eyes that honestly kind of scared me. "Hey, Ethan, want to see something that is going to make Regina lose her mind?" he asked. "I am not sure I want to be an accessory to whatever you are planning," I said, but I walked over anyway because my life had gotten boring and I needed entertainment. "I am going to pave over my entire backyard," Robert said, gesturing to the half-acre of grass behind his house. "Including the septic field." I nearly spit out my coffee. "You cannot pave over a septic field. That is insane. It will destroy the system." "Actually," Robert pulled out a folder thick with documents, "there is nothing in the county code that explicitly prohibits it. I have been doing research for the past month. I talked to 3 different lawyers. As long as I am not connecting to the municipal sewer, and as long as I am not creating a public health hazard at the moment of construction, I can do whatever I want with my property. The septic system will fail eventually, sure, but that failure will be my problem. And by the time it fails and I am legally required to do something about it, the HOA deadline for sewer connection will have passed. But you will destroy your own septic system. Where will your sewage go?" Robert's smile was not pleasant. "I have been collecting documentation of every single HOA violation notice Regina has sent me, 43 in the past 4 months. I have emails where she admits she is trying to force me to sell and move. I have recordings of her telling neighbors that she wants to make an example of me. I have proof that she filed false complaints with the health department. My lawyer says I have a solid case for harassment. When the septic system fails and becomes a health emergency, it will not be my fault. It will be the direct result of the HOA forcing me into an impossible situation. They will be liable." I stared at him. "You are going to create a sewage disaster on purpose. I am going to follow the HOA rules and pave my backyard, which requires approval only for front yard improvements. The fact that my septic field happens to be in the backyard is just an unfortunate coincidence. When the system fails, the county will require immediate connection to the sewer line, which means the HOA cannot fine me for missing their arbitrary deadline, because it will be an emergency situation. And Regina will have to explain to everyone why her harassment campaign directly led to a public health crisis. It was absolutely insane. It was also kind of brilliant in a scorched earth, mutually assured destruction way. "When are you starting?" I asked. "Today. I rented a concrete mixer. I have a crew coming at 9. I should have tried to talk him out of it. I should have been the voice of reason. Instead, I said, "I will make popcorn." The construction crew arrived right on schedule. 4 guys with a concrete mixer truck started in the back corner of Robert's yard, farthest from the house. Robert had marked out the entire area with stakes and string. It was extensive, covering almost the entire backyard except for a small strip along the back fence. Regina's white Escalade came screeching into Robert's driveway at 9:45. I was watching from my kitchen window, which had a perfect view of the unfolding drama. She marched into the backyard, velour tracksuit blazing in the morning sun, her phone already out and recording. "What do you think you are doing?" Her voice carried across the yards. Several other neighbors had come out to watch. "I am improving my property," Robert said calmly, "creating a lovely paved patio area, Low maintenance, no grass to mow, very tidy. You need HOA approval for this. Robert pulled out another folder. Section 18, subsection 2 of the bylaws. Backyard improvements that are not visible from the street require notification but not approval. I sent an email to the HOA address at 6 this morning. Check your inbox. Regina's face went through several shades of red. You cannot pave over a septic field. Show me where it says that in the HOA bylaws, Robert said. I will wait. This is going to cause a health hazard. Then you should not have forced through that bylaw requiring sewer connection. I am simply making improvements to my property while I figure out how to afford the $15,000 connection fee. If my septic system happens to fail in the process, well, that is what happens when the HOA makes unreasonable demands. I could see the moment Regina realized what was happening. Her eyes went wide, then narrow. You are doing this on purpose. You are trying to create a disaster. I am following all applicable laws and HOA regulations, Robert said. If you have concerns about the safety of my construction project, you are welcome to call the county. I have all my permits in order. Regina absolutely did call the county. She called while standing in Robert's backyard. I could hear her practically screaming into her phone about health hazards and septic systems and irresponsible homeowners. To her credit, the county sent someone out within 2 hours. The inspector was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Gary Walsh, who had clearly dealt with HOA disputes before. He walked the property with Robert, examined the permits, looked at the construction work, and checked his tablet extensively. You know this is going to destroy your septic system, Gary said. I am aware, Robert replied. Is there any law preventing me from doing this? Gary sighed. Not at the moment of construction, no. You have got proper permits for the concrete work. The septic system is currently functional. But when it fails, and it will fail very quickly once you pave over the drain field, you will have a mandatory emergency connection order. That is going to be expensive and messy. I understand. Why would you do this? Gary asked, and he sounded genuinely baffled. Robert gestured to Regina, who was standing at the property line with her phone out, still recording everything. Ask the HOA. Gary looked at Regina, then back at Robert, and I saw understanding dawn on his face. This is one of those HOA things. This is definitely one of those HOA things, Robert confirmed. Gary closed his tablet. The work is permitted and legal as it stands right now. I am going to file a report noting that the property owner is aware of the risks to his septic system. When this goes sideways, Mr. Hendricks, you are going to have a serious problem. I have a serious problem already, Robert said, looking directly at Regina. At least this way it will be a problem everyone can see. The concrete work continued for 3 days. Robert had his entire backyard paved into a massive concrete slab. It looked absolutely ridiculous, like a parking lot behind a suburban house, but it was technically legal. I watched from my yard as the concrete trucks came and went, as the workers spread and smoothed tons of concrete over what had been grass and, critically, over the septic drain field. Regina sent daily emails to the entire neighborhood. She called emergency HOA meetings. She contacted a lawyer. But there was nothing she could do. Robert had followed every rule, obtained every permit, and submitted all required notifications. The fact that he was deliberately sabotaging his own septic system was not illegal, just insane. The disaster happened faster than anyone expected. 5 days after the concrete work finished, I woke up to the smell of sewage. It was faint at first, just a whiff when I went out to get the morning paper, but by mid-morning it was unmistakable. Something was very, very wrong. Robert's house sat slightly uphill from mine, so when his septic system backed up, the sewage did not just pool in his basement. It started seeping through the concrete he had just poured, finding cracks and gaps, and then running downhill through the soil. My backyard began developing wet, brown patches that smelled like a nightmare. I called Robert immediately. "Dude, your plan is affecting my property now." "I know," he said, and he actually sounded apologetic. "I am sorry about that. I honestly did not think it would spread this fast. I am documenting everything. Your property damage is part of the lawsuit." "What lawsuit?" "The one against the HOA for forcing me into this situation. My lawyer says you should document all damage and keep receipts for any cleanup costs. The HOA's liability insurance is going to cover it." 3 other neighbors called me within the hour. The sewage was spreading. What had started as Robert's problem was becoming a neighborhood crisis. The smell was unbearable. Brown, contaminated water was seeping into at least 6 yards along the slope. Regina called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. Every single homeowner showed up, which was a first in the subdivision's history. People were angry, disgusted, and demanding answers. The community clubhouse smelled like the sewage that half the neighborhood had tracked in on their shoes. Regina stood at the front of the room, looking more frazzled than I had ever seen her. Barbara and Susan flanked her like backup singers who had forgotten the words to the song. "This is a disaster entirely of Robert Hendricks' making," Regina announced. "He deliberately sabotaged his septic system in violation of common sense and basic decency." Robert stood up from his seat in the back row. "I followed every single HOA rule. I obtained all required permits. I notified the board of my construction plans as required by the bylaws. The septic failure is a direct result of the HOA forcing expensive upgrades without adequate time or support for homeowners to comply." "You paved over your septic field," Regina shrieked, "which is not prohibited by any HOA rule or county ordinance. You know what is prohibited: harassment. Filing false complaints with government agencies. Imposing arbitrary rules that target specific homeowners. I have documentation of all of it." The room erupted into arguments. Neighbors were yelling at Robert for creating a health hazard. Other neighbors were yelling at Regina for pushing the sewer connection rule in the first place. Someone mentioned class action lawsuits. Someone else threatened to call the police. That is when Gary Walsh from the county health department walked in, followed by 2 other officials and a police officer. "I am going to need everyone to calm down," Gary said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We have received multiple complaints about sewage contamination in this neighborhood. I am here to inform you that we are issuing a mandatory evacuation order for 6 properties in the immediate contamination zone until the source is contained and remediation is complete." The room went silent. "Evacuation," someone whispered. "The sewage contamination has entered the groundwater and is spreading through the soil. This is now a public health emergency. The affected properties are uninhabitable until cleanup is completed and certified safe." Gary read off a list of addresses. Mine was 4th on the list. I felt my stomach drop. I had to evacuate my own house because of this insane HOA war. "Who is responsible for the cleanup costs?" asked Jim Morrison, my neighbor 2 houses down who had sewage in his basement. "That is going to be determined by the county attorney and the involved parties' insurance companies," Gary said. "But right now, our priority is public health and safety. Mr. Hendricks, you are being issued a notice of violation and a mandatory connection order. You have 72 hours to arrange emergency connection to the municipal sewer line or face criminal charges for maintaining a public health nuisance." Robert nodded. "I understand. I have already contacted emergency plumbing services. The connection will be completed within 48 hours. That is going to cost a fortune, Barbara said. Emergency sewer connections run about $30,000 to $40,000, Robert said calmly. My homeowner's insurance is covering it as an emergency repair. They will be pursuing subrogation against any parties found liable for creating the circumstances that led to this situation. He looked directly at Regina when he said it. The county officials began organizing the evacuation. 6 families had to pack bags and find hotels or stay with relatives. The affected properties were marked with bright orange signs warning of biohazard contamination. A remediation company was called in to begin cleanup, which involved excavating contaminated soil, treating the affected areas, and testing groundwater. I ended up staying at a hotel near the highway for 9 days. The county picked up the initial costs, but we were all told to keep receipts because the financial responsibility was going to be sorted out through legal channels. During those 9 days, I watched the situation spiral into something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The local news picked up the story. HOA dispute leads to sewage disaster in Naperville neighborhood ran on 3 different channels. Regina declined to comment, but that did not stop the reporters from digging into the HOA's history. It turned out that Regina had a pattern of aggressive enforcement against specific homeowners. Over the past 5 years, 8 families had sold their homes and moved out of Meadowbrook Heights after extended disputes with the HOA. 3 of those families had filed formal complaints with the Illinois Attorney General's office about harassment and discriminatory enforcement of rules. None of those complaints had gone anywhere individually, but together they painted a picture of systematic abuse. The Illinois Attorney General's office got involved. They launched an investigation into the HOA's practices, financial records, and governance. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Regina had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Not huge amounts, but consistent and ongoing. 5 years of charging personal meals, shopping trips, and even a vacation to the HOA's debit card, all justified as community business expenses. It totaled nearly $18,000. That moved the situation from civil disputes into criminal territory. I was back home, my property cleaned and certified safe, when the police showed up to arrest Regina Daniels. It was a Tuesday morning, almost exactly 2 months after Robert had started pouring concrete. I watched from my porch as 2 Naperville police officers knocked on Regina's door, spoke with her briefly, and then walked her to their patrol car in handcuffs. She was charged with theft and embezzlement. The HOA's insurance company dropped coverage the moment the criminal charges were filed. Barbara and Susan immediately resigned from the board. The remaining homeowners called an emergency meeting to dissolve the existing HOA leadership and implement oversight measures to prevent future abuses. Robert's lawsuit against the HOA moved forward. His lawyer argued that the harassment and unreasonable demands had directly caused the septic disaster, making the HOA liable for all damages. The HOA's former insurance company initially fought the claim, but when the evidence of Regina's harassment campaign came out during discovery, including emails where she explicitly stated her goal was to force Robert to sell and move, they settled. Robert received a settlement covering his emergency sewer connection costs, legal fees, and damages for emotional distress. The 6 families affected by the contamination, including me, received settlements covering evacuation costs, property remediation, and diminished property values. My settlement was $32,000, which more than covered my hotel stay, and the lingering smell that took another month to completely dissipate from my yard. The criminal case against Regina took longer to resolve. She initially pleaded not guilty, claiming the HOA expenses were legitimate business costs. But the prosecution had receipts from spa visits, boutique clothing stores, and a weekend trip to Lake Geneva that had all been charged to the HOA account and marked as community outreach or administrative expenses. Her lawyer eventually negotiated a plea deal. Regina pleaded guilty to one count of theft over $10,000, a Class 3 felony in Illinois. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and ordered to pay full restitution of $18,437 to the Homeowners Association. She also had to resign from any HOA leadership positions and was prohibited from serving on any community boards during her probation period. The judge gave a statement during sentencing that stuck with me. He said that homeowners associations serve an important function in maintaining community standards, but that power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. He noted that Regina had used her position to target homeowners she personally disliked, to enrich herself with community funds, and to create an environment of fear and harassment. He said her actions had directly contributed to a public health crisis that displaced families and caused extensive property damage. Regina cried during the sentencing. She apologized to the community, to the affected families, to everyone she had wronged. But it felt hollow, like she was sorry she got caught rather than sorry for what she had done. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA underwent massive restructuring after the disaster. A new board was elected with actual oversight measures in place. Financial statements had to be reviewed monthly by an independent accountant. Board members had to attend training on fair housing laws and proper governance. Any fine over $100 required a vote by the full board, not just the president's decision. Homeowners gained the right to appeal violations to a neutral third party. Most importantly, the stupid sewer connection mandate was repealed. The 8 homes with septic systems were allowed to maintain them as long as they passed regular inspections. Robert got his emergency connection anyway since his system was destroyed, but at least the other 7 families were not forced into unnecessary expenses. Robert's house sold 6 months later for $20,000 above asking price. The concrete backyard was actually marketed as a feature, a huge low-maintenance patio perfect for entertaining. Some young couple with dreams of outdoor furniture and fire pits bought it immediately. Robert moved to a small town in Wisconsin where there was no HOA, just neighbors who occasionally borrowed lawn equipment and minded their own business. I ran into him at a coffee shop in Naperville a week before his move. We sat down and talked about everything that had happened. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "The whole scorched earth thing with the septic field." Robert thought about it for a long moment. "I regret that other people got caught in the blast radius. I honestly did not think the contamination would spread that fast or that far. I should have anticipated that better. But do I regret standing up to Regina and that toxic HOA culture? Not even a little bit. You created a literal sewage disaster. I followed every rule and obtained every permit. The disaster happened because the HOA created an impossible situation and then refused to back down even when it was clear they were wrong. If Regina had just left me alone about the garden beds, none of this would have happened. If she had not pushed that sewer mandate, none of this would have happened. If she had not filed false complaints and harassed me for months, none of this would have happened. I just forced the consequences to happen faster and more visibly than they would have otherwise. That is a hell of a rationalization. Maybe, Robert admitted, but it worked. Regina is a convicted felon now. The HOA has actual oversight. Homeowners have real protections. The rules are enforced fairly instead of being weaponized against whoever the president doesn't like. Was it worth 9 days in a hotel and the smell of sewage? For the neighborhood, yeah, I think it was. I wanted to argue with him to say there had to have been a better way, but I could not think of one. Every legal avenue had been exhausted. Regina had controlled the board completely. She had ignored complaints, doubled down on harassment, and used her position to make Robert's life miserable. Sometimes the only way to expose a broken system is to break it completely. "What are you going to do in Wisconsin?" I asked. "Buy a house with some land. Plant a massive vegetable garden. Maybe get some chickens. Live somewhere that the closest neighbor is far enough away that they cannot measure my grass height." He smiled, and it was the first genuinely relaxed expression I had seen on his face in months. We shook hands and wished each other well. I watched him drive away in a rented moving truck, headed north to a life without architectural review committees and violation notices. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The orange biohazard signs came down. The remediate yards grew new grass. Property values recovered once the news cycle moved on to other disasters. The new HOA board actually did a decent job, focusing on legitimate community maintenance rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules. I got a new neighbor in Robert's old house, a quiet accountant named Dave who mostly kept to himself and seemed thrilled about the concrete backyard. We talked occasionally over the fence, usually about sports or the weather. I never told him the full story of what had happened. The reputation of the neighborhood had taken enough of a hit without me spreading tales of the great septic disaster of 2026. Barbara moved away about a year after everything went down. She sold her house quietly and relocated to Arizona. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she could not handle the stigma of having been part of Regina's board, even though she had never been charged with anything. Susan stayed but kept her head down, never volunteering for any community positions again. Regina finished her community service and probation. I saw her occasionally at the grocery store or driving through the neighborhood. She had aged visibly, her hair gone fully gray, the confident aggression replaced with a hunched, defeated posture. She never made eye contact with anyone. Her house went up for sale the day her probation ended, and she moved to somewhere in Florida within a month. I heard she took a job doing administrative work for a property management company, though I cannot imagine who would hire her given the public record of her conviction. The legal fallout continued for years in various forms. Several of the families who had been forced out by Regina's harassment campaign filed civil suits seeking damages. Most settled out of court with the HOA's former insurance company. One case went to trial and resulted in a verdict of $200,000 for a family Regina had targeted with daily violation notices over a fence that was half an inch taller than regulations allowed. That family had eventually sold their house at a loss, just to escape the constant harassment. The Illinois Attorney General's office used the Meadowbrook Heights case as an example when they drafted new legislation regarding HOA governance and accountability. The law that passed required all Illinois homeowners associations to file annual financial reports with the state, to carry minimum liability insurance, and to provide homeowners with clear appeal processes for violations. It was not perfect, but it was progress. I stayed in Meadowbrook Heights because, despite everything, I liked my house and most of my neighbors. The community that emerged after the disaster was actually stronger in some ways. People paid attention to HOA meetings now. The board members knew they were being watched and held accountable. Rules were enforced consistently and fairly. It was what the HOA should have been all along, before Regina turned it into her personal fiefdom. Sometimes I walk past the spot where Robert's backyard meets mine, where the property line runs between his concrete slab and my grass. I think about those few weeks when sewage seeped through the ground, when the smell of disaster hung over the neighborhood, when we all watched a man deliberately destroy his own property to prove a point. It was insane. It was extreme. It was also the only thing that worked. I think about all the homeowners who suffer under petty tyrants in HOAs across the country, who pay endless fines for violations that serve no purpose except to inflate the ego of whoever is in charge. I think about the families who sell their houses and move away rather than fight back, who decide the hassle is not worth the battle. I think about how many Regina Daniels are out there right now, measuring grass height and threatening fines, drunk on the tiny bit of power that comes from enforcing rules in a suburban subdivision. Robert's scorched earth approach would not work for everyone. Most people do not have the patience, the resources, or the willingness to sacrifice their own property to make a point. Most people just want to live in peace, to come home from work and not deal with violation notices about their mailbox color or their holiday decorations. But every once in a while, you need someone crazy enough to pave over their own septic field just to prove that the emperor has no clothes, that the rules being enforced are arbitrary, and the people enforcing them are drunk on power. You need someone willing to create a disaster to expose the disaster that already existed under the surface. The health department arrived fast that day when the sewage started spreading, but the real sickness in Meadowbrook Heights had been growing for years. It took a man willing to break his own septic system to finally expose it, to force everyone to pay attention to the toxic culture Regina had created, to make the invisible visible. I learned a lot from watching that disaster unfold. I learned that sometimes following the rules perfectly can be the most rebellious act possible. I learned that systems protect themselves until the cost of maintaining them becomes too high to ignore. I learned that documentation and patience, and a willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term justice, can accomplish what years of complaints and appeals cannot. Most importantly, I learned to read every single page of my HOA bylaws, to attend meetings, to vote in board elections, and to never assume that someone else is paying attention to how power is being used in my community. Accountability only exists when people demand it and enforce it. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA is better now because Robert Hendricks was willing to make it worse first. That is not a lesson they teach you in civics class, but it is true nonetheless. Sometimes you have to let the septic system fail completely before anyone will acknowledge that something is fundamentally broken. I still get the occasional violation notice. Last month, the HOA informed me that my front porch light was out and needed to be replaced within 10 days to maintain community standards. I replaced it the next day and thought nothing of it because it was a reasonable request, enforced consistently across the neighborhood, and came without threats or harassment. That is what an HOA is supposed to do. Maintain genuine community standards, not manufacture violations to justify someone's power trip. My grass is exactly 2 inches tall, measured this morning. My mailbox is the approved shade of black. My holiday lights will come down by January 5th. I follow the rules because they are reasonable rules, enforced fairly by people who are held accountable. And if that ever changes, if some future Regina Daniels takes control of the board and starts using violation notices as weapons, I know exactly where I can buy 40 bags of concrete mix and rent a mixer truck. I would not really pave over my septic field. Probably. But it is comforting to know that the option exists, that there is a nuclear option available if things ever get that bad again. The health department would arrive fast if I did. I know that now. But so would accountability, exposure, and justice. Sometimes that is what it takes. Robert sent me a card last Christmas from Wisconsin. It had a picture of his new house, a farmhouse on 5 acres with no neighbors visible in any direction. The back of the card said, "No HOA, no violations, no regrets. Thanks for being a good neighbor during the chaos." I stuck the card on my refrigerator where I see it every morning. It reminds me that there are places without architectural review committees and violation notices, where people can paint their front doors whatever color they want and plant vegetable gardens without permission. But it also reminds me that when you do live in a place with an HOA, you have a responsibility to make sure it serves the community rather than controlling it. You have to pay attention, participate, and hold leaders accountable before things get bad enough that someone feels compelled to pave over their septic field just to make a point. The story of the Great Septic Disaster is still told in Meadowbrook Heights, usually by long-time residents explaining to new neighbors why our HOA has such strict oversight measures and why financial statements are reviewed monthly by an independent accountant. The details get exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions have raw sewage flooding entire streets. Others claim the contamination reached the local creek and killed fish. The truth was bad enough without embellishment, but I understand the impulse to make the story bigger because the lesson is important. Never give unchecked power to someone who enjoys wielding it. Never assume that rules are being enforced fairly just because they are being enforced. Never ignore the warning signs of a toxic culture just because it is not affecting you directly. And never, ever underestimate what a desperate person with permits and concrete will do when pushed too far. The concrete in Robert's old backyard is still there. A massive slab that serves as a patio for Dave the accountant, who grills steaks on it every weekend during the summer. Sometimes I smell the charcoal smoke and remember the smell of sewage, the orange biohazard signs, the 9 days in a hotel watching news coverage of my own neighborhood. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only a few years. The neighborhood has healed. Property values have recovered. New families have moved in who have no idea what happened here, who see the well-maintained houses and manicured lawns and assume this is just another quiet suburban subdivision. I know better. I know what lies beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. I know how close we came to permanent damage, how the contamination could have reached the groundwater supply if it had spread just a bit further. I know how lucky we were that Robert's insane plan actually worked, that it exposed the corruption and forced changes instead of just creating a disaster with no resolution. It could have gone differently. Robert could have faced criminal charges. The contamination could have been worse. Regina could have deflected blame successfully. The HOA could have continued on its toxic path with a new figurehead enforcing the same petty tyranny, but it did not go that way. Justice, messy and smelly and expensive as it was, prevailed. I think about that sometimes when I am tempted to ignore HOA meeting announcements or skip board elections, because I am too busy or too tired to care. I think about Regina in handcuffs, about Robert loading concrete mixers, about the orange biohazard signs and the smell that hung over the neighborhood for weeks. I think about the price of apathy and the cost of accountability. Then I read the meeting agenda, review the financial statements, and show up to vote. It is the least I can do to honor the sacrifice of one man's septic system and the disaster it took to finally clean up our community.